Who let this monkey near my piano?
I just wanted to play one song, sir.
Play? You hear that? The cockroach wants to play. Look at these black cracked hands. Stinking of bleach. These are mop rags. Dirty hands. Don't touch my piano. Fine. Playboy. Show us what a stray dog can do with a Steinway. Give us a good laugh.
The janitor sat down. His fingers were shaking. But what no one in that room knew was that those dirty hands had once made 3 American presidents rise to their feet. That morning, 12 hours before the shove, before the Steinway, before any of it, Preston Hayes woke up the same way he'd woken up every day for the past 6 years. Alone. 5:15 a.m. Southeast D.C. A 1-bedroom apartment on the 3rd floor of a building where the elevator hadn't worked since last winter. The radiator clicked and hissed in a rhythm Preston knew by heart. 2 clicks, a long hiss, pause, repeat. It was the closest thing to music in his life these days. 14 steps from bed to kitchen. He counted every one. Left hand trailing the wall, fingertips reading the texture. Smooth drywall, then the door frame, then the peeling edge of wallpaper where the hallway turned. 14 steps. Same as yesterday. Same as the 6 years before that. The coffee was instant. Always instant. He kept it on the 2nd shelf, right side, behind the salt. His fingers found the Braille label he'd stuck on the jar, a habit Eleanor had taught him when the darkness first started creeping in. Eleanor, his wife, the woman who'd labeled every can, every bottle, every drawer in this apartment, as if she was building him a map for the life she knew she wouldn't be part of much longer. Cancer took her 6 years ago. Quick and cruel. 4 months from diagnosis to funeral. On the nightstand sat a framed photograph Preston hadn't seen in 17 years. But every morning, before coffee, before anything, he touched it. His fingers traced the glass. He knew what was in that picture. A younger version of himself, eyes still bright, still seeing, shaking hands with a man in a dark suit. The background was blurred, but anyone who'd been there would have recognized the East Room of the White House. Preston didn't linger on it. He never did. He just touched the frame, set it down, and started his day. He ironed his janitor uniform by touch, every crease deliberate, collar flat, sleeves straight, name badge pinned exactly 2 inches below the left shoulder. Most people would have thrown on a wrinkled uniform for a job like his. Not Preston. Eleanor always said you could tell everything about a man by how he treated the things no one else would notice. So he ironed. Every single morning. The bus ride to the Grand Meridian Hotel took 40 minutes. Preston sat in the same seat. 3rd row, left side, closest to the window he couldn't see through. He liked that seat because the vent above it blew warm air on cold mornings, and because the driver, a woman named Gloria, always said, "Mornin', Mr. Hayes," when he got on, and "Have a good one, Mr. Hayes," when he got off. 2 sentences. That was enough. Some days they were the only words anyone said to him. The Grand Meridian was one of the most prestigious hotels in Washington, D.C. Presidents had stayed there. Foreign dignitaries. CEOs. The lobby had Italian marble floors, hand-painted ceilings, and a chandelier that reportedly cost more than every apartment on Preston's block combined. Preston had mopped that marble for 9 years. 9 years of pushing a yellow bucket past guests who looked through him like he was part of the wallpaper. 9 years of, "Excuse me," met with silence. 9 years of stepping aside so men in suits could pass without adjusting their stride. He wasn't bitter about it. That was the thing. He just did it. Showed up. Mopped. Cleaned restrooms. Emptied trash cans. Polished brass handles until they reflected a face he couldn't see. His colleague, Darnell Cooper, was the closest thing Preston had to a friend. 34, built like a linebacker, voice like a preacher on Sunday morning. Darnell had been working at the Grand Meridian for 3 years, And from day one, he'd taken it upon himself to carry Preston's supply cart to the service elevator every shift. "You don't have to do that, Darnell." "I know I don't. I'm doing it anyway." That was their routine. Every shift. No negotiation. Darnell was also the only person at the Grand Meridian who knew Preston could play piano. It happened by accident, about 2 years back. Darnell was pulling a late shift, walking past the staff break room at 2 in the morning, when he heard something that stopped him in the hallway. Music, coming from behind the closed door. Soft, but full, rich. Like a sound that had no business coming from a room with plastic chairs and a broken vending machine. He opened the door just a crack. Preston was sitting at the battered old upright piano that someone had donated years ago. Eyes closed, though with Preston that didn't mean anything. Fingers moving across the keys like water finding its path through stone. Darnell stood in that doorway for 20 minutes. Didn't breathe. Didn't move. When Preston finally stopped, Darnell quietly pulled the door shut and walked away. He never told anyone. But the next morning he asked Preston one question. "Who are you, man, for real?" Preston smiled, the kind of smile that answers nothing and says everything. "I'm the guy who mops the lobby, Darnell. Same as yesterday." What Darnell didn't know, what Preston never told anyone, was the full story. The scholarship to the Thornton Conservatory. The debut recital that earned a standing ovation from an audience of 800. The invitation to play at a White House state dinner at age 31. Then again at 35. Then again at 39. 3 consecutive presidents, each one requesting him by name. Then the diagnosis. Retinitis pigmentosa. Degenerative. Irreversible. The world closed in like a slow curtain. By 44, everything was dark. And the invitations stopped. Not because he couldn't play. His fingers hadn't forgotten a single note. His ears heard more now than they ever had when his eyes worked. But the industry, the agents, the promoters, the venues, they didn't know what to do with a blind black pianist who refused to be packaged as an inspiration story. He wouldn't do the interviews, wouldn't do the triumph over tragedy segments, wouldn't sit on a morning show couch and let a host pat his hand and say, "You're so brave." He wasn't brave. He was a musician. And they wanted a story, not an artist. So Preston Hayes disappeared. No farewell concert, no press release, just silence. The kind of silence that swallows a man whole if he lets it. Under his bed sat a locked wooden case. Inside, 3 pieces of sheet music, each signed by a different president of the United States. He hadn't opened that case in years. Couldn't bring himself to. It was the last proof that he'd once been someone. And touching proof of a life you've lost is a particular kind of pain that doesn't have a name. He was 2 months behind on rent. The landlord had slipped a final notice under his door last Tuesday. Preston had felt the envelope, known exactly what it was by the weight and the stiffness of the paper, and set it on the kitchen counter without opening it. Eleanor's ring was gone. Pawned 4 months ago to cover groceries. But the groove on his finger remained, a ridge of skin where gold used to be. He rubbed it sometimes without thinking, a habit from a life that used to fit. If you'd walked past Preston Hayes on the street that morning, a blind man in a pressed gray uniform, white cane tapping the sidewalk, you wouldn't have looked twice. Nobody ever did. If you think you know where this story's going, trust me, you don't. Stay with me. Gerald Whitmore didn't walk into rooms. Rooms rearranged themselves around it. That evening at 6:45 sharp, a black Rolls-Royce Phantom pulled up to the Grand Meridian's private entrance. The door opened before the car fully stopped. 2 hotel staff stood at attention. A third held an umbrella, even though it wasn't raining. That was the kind of man Gerald Whitmore was. People prepared for problems that didn't exist just to make sure he never experienced discomfort. He stepped out. 58 years old, silver temples, a custom Tom Ford tuxedo that cost more than Preston Hayes would earn in a year. His shoes were handmade Italian leather. His watch, a Patek Philippe, caught the light from the hotel entrance and threw it back like a small, expensive sun. Gerald didn't acknowledge the staff, didn't nod, didn't blink in their direction. They existed to serve. Acknowledgement was a gift, and Gerald Whitmore didn't give gifts to people who couldn't give anything back. His wife, Audrey, stepped out behind him. Elegant, blonde, a string of pearls around her neck that she touched too often, the way people touch things they aren't sure they deserve. She walked 2 steps behind Gerald, always 2 steps, not because he asked her to, because she'd learned that walking beside him meant being corrected later, in the car, in a voice that never rose above a whisper but cut deeper than shouting ever could. The Whitmore Foundation Annual Arts and Philanthropy Gala was Gerald's crown jewel, held every spring. 400 guests, senators, CEOs, media moguls, old money, new money, money that had been money so long it forgot what it used to be. On paper, the gala raised funds for underprivileged arts programs. In reality, it was a stage, and Gerald was the only performer who mattered. He entered the ballroom and the room shifted. Conversations lowered. A sommelier changed direction mid-stride. A young woman from the catering team straightened her posture so fast she nearly dropped a tray of champagne flutes. This was what power looked like when it didn't need to announce itself. It just walked in, and everything else adjusted. Gerald made his way through the crowd the way a man walks through a garden he owns. Slow, proprietary. He shook hands with a senator, leaned in close to a hedge fund manager and said something that made the man laugh too hard. He accepted a glass of champagne from a waiter, held it up to the light, studied it for 3 seconds, then handed it back without tasting it. "Bring me another one. This glass has fingerprints." The waiter's face didn't change. He'd been trained not to react, but his hand trembled as he took the glass back. That was Gerald's art. He never raised his voice, never made a scene. He just pressed. Small, constant, precise cruelties that reminded everyone in the room of the distance between them and him. A young black cellist stood near the stage, waiting for her introduction. She'd been invited to perform a short piece before the headline act. She was 23. First time at an event like this. Nervous, but holding it together. When Gerald passed her, she extended her hand. "Mr. Whitmore, it's such an honor to—" "Is the real entertainment here yet?" Gerald said to his assistant, loud enough for the cellist to hear. He didn't look at her, didn't slow down, just kept walking. The cellist's hand hung in the air for a moment. Then she lowered it, quietly, the way people do when they've just learned something about the world they can't unlearn. Later, Gerald stood near the stage, running his hand along the lid of the Steinway grand piano that sat under the spotlight. This piano was his. He donated it to the hotel 3 years ago, a $200,000 instrument, handcrafted, one of fewer than 100 in the world. His name was engraved on a brass plate bolted to its side. Gerald Whitmore, patron of the arts. He touched that brass plate the way a man touches a trophy. Possessive, proud. This piano wasn't here to make music. It was here to make a statement. He turned to his inner circle. 3 men in identical black suits who laughed when he laughed and agreed before he finished his sentences. "You know what separates us from them?" Gerald said, gesturing vaguely toward the service staff lining the walls. "They think small. Permanently." The 3 men nodded. One of them chuckled. At that same moment, 40 feet away, behind the swinging doors of the kitchen corridor, Preston Hayes was mopping a spill. Quiet. Invisible. His cane leaned against the wall beside him. The ballroom doors swung open for a passing waiter, and for a brief second, the sound of the Steinway being tuned drifted through. Just a few notes. Bright. Clean. Cutting through the noise of the kitchen like a voice calling a name. Preston stopped mopping. His head tilted. His fingers twitched at his side. 2 men in the same room. One owned the piano. The other understood it. The headline pianist was supposed to arrive at 7:30. By 7:45, the event coordinator was pacing behind the stage curtain with a phone pressed to her ear. By 8 o'clock, her face had gone white. The pianist's flight from New York had been grounded. Mechanical failure. No backup. No understudy. No plan B. The stage sat empty. The Steinway gleamed under the spotlight like a beautiful promise no one could keep. Guests began to notice. Conversations shifted from polite small talk to murmurs. A few checked their programs. The 8 o'clock performance slot came and went. Then 8:15. The silence where music should have been grew louder by the minute. Gerald noticed. Of course he noticed. This was his gala. His name on every banner, every program, every napkin ring. He pulled the event coordinator aside. "Where is he?" "Mr. Whitmore, his flight." "I don't care about his flight. I care about 400 people staring at an empty stage with my name on it. Fix it." "Sir, I'm trying to fix it." He walked away before she could finish. That was another thing about Gerald. He gave orders the way other people breathed, automatically without any expectation of resistance. But there was no fix. Not tonight. The backup list had been called. Every available pianist in the DC area was either booked or unreachable. The coordinator stood backstage, staring at her phone, knowing that the next 60 minutes would be the longest of her career. Meanwhile, Preston Hayes had finished his shift. He'd clocked out at 8, changed nothing about his routine. Mop, bucket, supply cart returned to the utility closet. Badge unclipped. Jacket on. White cane in his right hand. He walked toward the service exit at the back of the hotel, the same door he used every night. The one that opened to the alley behind the loading dock, where the air smelled like kitchen grease and exhaust fumes. But tonight, something pulled at him. The service corridor ran parallel to the ballroom's east wall. Most nights, that wall was just a wall. Muffled voices, clinking glass, nothing that concerned him. But tonight, as Preston passed, the ballroom doors at the far end of the corridor were propped open. A catering cart had jammed in the doorway, and no one had bothered to fix it yet. Through that gap, the sound of the Steinway floated into the hallway. Not music, just the tuner's last notes still hanging in the air. A single, sustained chord. F major. Bright. Open. The kind of sound that doesn't ask permission to be heard. Preston stopped walking. His cane hovered an inch above the floor. His head turned toward the sound the way a plant turns toward light. Not a decision, just a reflex buried so deep it didn't need permission from his brain. He stood there for 10 seconds. 15. His fingers moved at his side, not dramatically, not like a movie, just small twitches. The muscle memory of 1,000 performances trying to wake up in hands that hadn't been allowed to remember. He should have kept walking, he knew that. The service exit was 30 steps ahead. His bus stop was a 5-minute walk after that. His apartment, his radiator, his instant coffee, his 14 steps from bed to kitchen, all of it waiting for him, same as always. But the F major chord was still ringing in his chest, and for the first time in 15 years, Preston Hayes turned toward the music instead of away from it. He moved through the corridor slowly. His cane found the doorframe. He stepped into the ballroom, not through the grand entrance with its velvet ropes and guest list, but through the side door, near the service bar, where the lighting was dim and no one was looking. The room was enormous. He couldn't see it, but he could feel it. The height of the ceiling and the way sound traveled upward and came back soft. The rustle of 400 bodies, the clink of crystal, the faint perfume of flowers he couldn't name. And underneath it all, the silence of a stage waiting to be filled. Preston navigated by memory and sound. He'd cleaned this ballroom hundreds of times. He knew where the tables were, where the stage began, where the 3 steps led up to the platform. His cane found the first step, then the second, then the third. The Steinway was 6 feet to his left. He could feel its presence the way you feel the warmth of a fireplace before you see the flames. Something large, resonant, alive. He sat down on the bench. His hands found the keys. And for a moment, just a moment, the ballroom, the guests, the gala, Gerald Whitmore, the rent, the loneliness, the darkness, all of it disappeared. There was only the piano. Preston's fingers rested on the keys for exactly 3 seconds before the world came crashing back in. The shove. Gerald's hand on his collar. The crack of his cane against marble. The laughter. The words. Monkey. Cockroach. Stray dog. Dirty hands. All of it happening fast and loud and public, the way cruelty always happens when the cruel person knows no one will stop them. And then it was over. Preston was on the floor, His knees on cold marble, his cane somewhere to his left. He could hear it still rolling, a faint hollow sound against stone. 400 people breathing, not one of them speaking. Gerald's voice above him, loud, satisfied, the voice of a man who had never been told no by anyone who mattered. Fine. Play, boy. Show us what a stray dog can do with a Steinway. Give us a good laugh. Preston knelt there, still, his hands flat against the marble. Cold seeped through his palms and up into his wrists, into his arms, into the place in his chest where something had been locked for a very long time. He thought about standing up and walking away. He knew where the service exit was, 30 steps, maybe 35 from here. He could be out the door, on the sidewalk, gone. And tomorrow, this would be nothing. A bad night. A story he'd never tell. He thought about the rent. 2 months overdue. The final notice on his kitchen counter. If he played, if he made a scene, Gerald Whitmore would fire him before the last note faded. And then what? No job, no income, no Eleanor to tell him it would be okay. His fingers curled against the marble. Then he heard her. Not really. Not in any way he could explain. But the voice was there, the same way it was there every morning when he ironed his uniform, every night when he touched the photograph by his bed. Your hands were made for more than this, baby. Don't you forget. Preston's jaw tightened. His breathing slowed. Something shifted behind his expression. Not anger, not defiance, something quieter than both. A decision made below language, in the part of a man that remembers who he was before the world told him to be smaller. He found his cane. He stood up. The crowd expected him to leave. Gerald had already turned his back, adjusting his cuffs, smirking at his circle. Preston didn't leave. He walked back to the bench, sat down, placed his hands on the keys. Gerald spun around. "Are you deaf and blind?" I said. "I heard you, sir. Every word." Preston's voice was low, steady, without a single trace of anger. But this piano didn't. The ballroom went still. Not quiet, still. The kind of stillness that happens when 400 people stop being individuals and become one single, held breath. Waiters froze mid-step. Conversations died between syllables. A woman at table 12 set down her champagne glass so carefully it didn't make a sound. Preston sat at the bench with his hands on the keys. His posture had changed. Not dramatically. If you weren't watching closely, you might have missed it. His shoulders dropped half an inch. His chin lifted. His spine straightened into a line that didn't belong to a janitor. It belonged to someone who had sat at instruments like this 1,000 times before. But his left hand was shaking. A visible tremor. The kind that comes not from fear, but from the weight of years pressing down on a single moment. 15 years since he'd touched a piano this fine. 15 years of silence. And now, under a spotlight he couldn't see, in front of a crowd that expected him to fail, his body was remembering. And the remembering hurt. He began. The first notes of Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor drifted into the room like smoke. Tentative. Fragile. Each note placed carefully, the way a man places his feet on ice he doesn't trust. The melody was there, but thin, stretched between hesitation and hope, as if the music itself wasn't sure it was allowed to exist. A man in the front row leaned toward his wife. "This is embarrassing," he whispered. Gerald Whitmore folded his arms. The smirk was back. He tilted his head and watched the way a cat watches something small and struggling. 8 bars in, Preston's right hand stumbled. A note landed a fraction late, then another. The tremble in his left hand spread to his right. For a moment, a terrible suspended moment, it seemed like Gerald was going to be right. The stray dog couldn't play. The cockroach had no business on that stage. The dirty hands were exactly what they looked like. Then Preston stopped. His hands lifted from the keys and hovered an inch above the ivory. Motionless. The last note he'd played, an F, hung in the air, unresolved, aching for somewhere to go. 1 second of silence. 2, 3, 4. The room shifted. People glanced at each other. A woman at table 9 pressed her hand against her mouth. Gerald unfolded his arms, opened his mouth to speak, and Preston's fingers came down. Not tentative, not fragile, not thin, full. The Chopin poured out of his hands like water breaking through a dam. The same ballade, the same key, the same notes, but transformed. Every hesitation was gone, every tremor burned away. His left hand drove the bass line with a force that vibrated through the legs of every chair in the first 3 rows. His right hand sang the melody with a clarity so sharp it felt like a blade drawing a clean line through the air. The woman at table 12 picked up her champagne glass and set it down again, because her hand was shaking too hard to hold it. Preston's body had changed. The janitor was gone. The man sitting at the Steinway now was someone else entirely, someone the room had never met but instantly recognized. The way he moved was different. His wrists were loose. His fingers struck and released with a precision that comes not from practice, but from a place beyond practice, where the music lives inside the muscle and the bone and the blood, and the hands are just the door it walks through. Gerald's smirk disappeared. Not slowly, all at once, like a light switched off. He took a half step backward, then another. Preston didn't notice. Preston didn't notice anything. He was somewhere else now. Somewhere the 400 guests and the chandeliers and the man who'd called him a cockroach couldn't reach. He was inside the music, and the music was inside him, and the boundary between them had dissolved completely. The Chopin built to its first climax, a passage of cascading octaves that demanded the full span of both hands. Preston's arms moved in wide, sweeping arcs across the keyboard. The bass notes rumbled deep enough to vibrate the champagne flutes on the nearest table. A fork rattled against a plate. Someone in the back row stood up, not to leave, but because sitting felt wrong. Like the music was pulling them upward. Then, without warning, without pause, without a single break in rhythm, Preston shifted. The Chopin dissolved into Gershwin, Rhapsody in Blue. The opening notes slid in like a conversation-changing language mid-sentence, seamless, audacious, impossible to prepare for. The classical structure fell away and something wilder took its place. Jazz rhythms, syncopation, notes that bent and swung and refused to land where you expected them to. A cellist in the audience, the same young black woman Gerald had dismissed earlier, sat forward in her chair. Her lips parted. She recognized what was happening. This wasn't a man playing 2 pieces. This was a man speaking 2 languages fluently and switching between them without accent. The technical skill required wasn't just rare, it was historic. The Gershwin danced through the room. It moved differently than the Chopin, lighter, faster, more dangerous. Preston's right hand ran up and down the treble keys in lines so fluid they sounded improvised. But every musician in the room knew they weren't. Each run was placed, each rest was intentional. The silence between notes was as composed as the notes themselves. A waiter standing near the kitchen door set down his tray, not because he was supposed to, because he forgot he was holding it. Then Preston shifted again. This time the room felt it before they heard it. The Gershwin faded, not abruptly but like sunset, one color bleeding into the next, and something new emerged. Something no one in that ballroom had ever heard before. This was Preston's own composition, the piece he'd written for Eleanor. It started with a single note, a middle C, held for 2 full beats, then a second note, then a third. A melody so simple it almost didn't seem like a melody at all. It sounded like a memory trying to become a sentence, like someone reaching for a word they haven't spoken in years. The melody was Eleanor's laugh. Not literally. Music can't reproduce a laugh, but anyone who has ever loved someone and lost them would have recognized what they were hearing. The shape of joy held in the hands of grief. The piece grew. Layers of harmony folded in, one on top of another. The simplicity deepened into complexity the way a still pond deepens when you realize it has no bottom. Dissonance crept in, a chord here, a passing tone there, and the music shifted from warmth to ache. This was the diagnosis, the first appointment, the specialist's voice explaining what degenerative meant. The slow closing of the world, light retreating from the edges, colors fading, faces becoming voices, and then the final, complete dark. The dissonance built, layers colliding, notes grinding against each other like tectonic plates. A woman in the fourth row pressed both hands to her chest. She didn't know why she was crying. She didn't know who Eleanor was. But the music knew, and the music told her everything she needed to feel. Then the fury came. Preston's hands crashed into the lower register. Deep, thunderous chords. Rage. Not the kind that shouts, but the kind that shakes the floor. This was the anger of a man who'd been forgotten. The concerts that stopped. The agents who stopped calling. The world that looked at a blind black man and decided his story was over before it ended. The anger was enormous and precise and absolutely controlled, and that control was what made it terrifying. The chandelier crystals above the stage trembled. Not from vibration, from resonance. The piano was singing at a frequency that made the glass hum in sympathy. Gerald Whitmore's face had gone pale. He stood 10 feet from the stage, his arms at his sides, his mouth slightly open. He looked like a man watching his own house burn down. Then, slowly, deliberately, the fury began to soften. Not disappear, soften. The thunderous bass chords thinned into single notes. The dissonance unraveled, thread by thread. And in its place, something new emerged. A resolution. Not a happy ending, something more complicated than that. Acceptance. The kind that doesn't pretend the pain wasn't real, but chooses to carry it forward instead of being crushed by it. The melody returned. Eleanor's laugh, but different now, older, wiser, wrapped in everything that had happened since. The loss, the blindness, the silence, the mop, the bleach, the loneliness, the 14 steps from bed to kitchen. All of it folded into the melody like flour into dough, invisible but essential, changing the texture of everything. This was the piece Preston had played at the White House. 3 times, for 3 presidents. Each time it had been different, because each time Preston had been different. The composition grew with him. It was alive. It breathed. And tonight, in a ballroom full of people who had watched him get shoved off a bench and called a cockroach, it breathed the deepest it had ever breathed. The final movement began. Preston's hands moved faster now. The melody climbed, higher, brighter, every note building on the last, stacking towards something the room could feel coming but couldn't name. A crescendo that didn't just increase in volume, it increased in meaning. Every bar carried more weight than the one before it. The music wasn't getting louder, it was getting truer. The room leaned forward, all of them. 400 bodies tilting toward the stage like flowers toward the sun. Then, the peak. A chord so full it used every note Preston's hands could reach. It rang through the ballroom like a bell, shaking crystal, vibrating silverware, pressing against the walls. And then Preston pulled back. Pianissimo, barely audible. The softest playing the room had heard all night. Each note a whisper, each rest a breath. The melody dissolved into single tones, spaced further and further apart, like stars appearing one at a time in a darkening sky. The last note, a single sustained G, floated into the silence. It didn't end. It faded, slowly, like a candle burning down to nothing in a room with no wind. Preston lifted his hands from the keys, placed them in his lap. His head was slightly bowed. His face was wet. 5 seconds of silence. No one breathed. No one moved. No one existed outside this room. Then Constance Bellamy, 76 years old, legendary concert pianist, a woman who had heard every great pianist alive, rose from her chair at table 4. Slowly, the way you rise in a cathedral. She began to clap, alone, in the silence. Her applause was the only sound in the ballroom, steady, deliberate, each clap landing like a heartbeat restarting. Senator Elaine Crawford stood next, then a man at table 6, then a woman across the aisle, then an entire row, then 2 rows, then... The room exploded. 400 people on their feet. Not polite applause, not the kind you give because you're supposed to. This was the kind that rips out of you before you can decide whether to give it. Hands slamming together, voices breaking. The young black cellist standing on her chair, clapping with her arms above her head, tears running down her face. Darnell Cooper stood in the service doorway, still in his uniform, one hand gripping the doorframe, the other wiping his face with his sleeve. The ovation shook the chandeliers. Preston sat at the bench, hands in his lap. He couldn't see the standing ovation, but he felt it. Every single pair of hands. And for the first time in 15 years, his own hands were still. The ovation didn't stop. It kept going. 30 seconds, 45, a full minute, rolling through the ballroom in waves that rebuilt themselves every time they seemed about to fade. People weren't just clapping, they were shouting. A man near the back cupped his hands around his mouth and yelled something no one could hear over the noise. A woman clutched her husband's arm with both hands, shaking her head, repeating the same 3 words. "Oh my God! Oh my God! Oh my God!" Phones were out, dozens of them, recording from every angle. The light from the screens dotted the ballroom like low, trembling stars. The young black cellist, the one Gerald had refused to look at, the one whose hand he'd left hanging in the air, was still standing on her chair. She wasn't clapping anymore. She was pressing both hands to her face, sobbing, and she didn't care who saw. Gerald Whitmore stood 10 feet from the stage. He hadn't moved. His arms hung at his sides. His face cycled through expressions too fast for any one of them to settle. Confusion first, then something close to denial, then a slow, creeping recognition that spread across his features like a stain on white cloth. The recognition wasn't just that he'd been wrong, it was that he'd been wrong publicly, permanently, in a room full of people who would never forget what they'd just witnessed. Audrey Whitmore had moved. Not far, just 3 steps to her left, away from Gerald. A small gap. But in a world where she'd spent 20 years standing exactly 2 steps behind him, those 3 steps were a canyon. And everyone in the front row noticed. Then the ovation began to quiet. Not because the crowd wanted to stop, but because Senator Elaine Crawford had risen from table 4 and was walking toward the stage. She moved slowly, deliberately, the way she'd once walked to the Senate podium, a woman whose presence didn't need volume. Someone handed her a microphone. The room settled. 400 people still standing, still trembling, waiting. Senator Crawford looked at Preston. Then she turned to the crowd. Her voice was steady, controlled. But underneath it, something shook. The man sitting at that piano is Preston Hayes. He is a graduate of the Thornton Conservatory. He performed at 3 consecutive White House state dinners, by presidential request. His original composition was played at a NATO summit dinner in Geneva. He has performed for heads of state, for diplomats, for audiences around the world. She paused. Let the silence do its work. The man your host just called a cockroach, the man he shoved off that bench and told to know his place, played for the leaders of the free world. And he did it with more grace than anyone in this room has shown tonight. The room didn't erupt. It cracked. A sound that was half applause and half something deeper. The sound of 400 people confronting the distance between who they thought they were and what they'd just allowed to happen. Gerald moved. Finally. He walked toward the stage, stiff, mechanical, the walk of a man who knows he's being watched and is trying to perform composure he doesn't feel. He stopped in front of Preston, cleared his throat. His voice came out a pitch higher than normal. I didn't know. If I had known who you were. Preston turned his face toward Gerald's voice. Slowly. His expression was calm, not angry, not triumphant, just clear. You didn't need to know who I was. You needed to know who you are. The ballroom erupted, louder than before. Gerald stood there with his mouth half open, his sentence unfinished, his apology unaccepted. And for the first time in his public life, he was small, not humbled. Small. There is a difference. Humility is a choice. Smallness is what happens when the world finally sees you at actual size. Then Constance Bellamy approached the stage. She extended her hand. Preston, guided by the sound of her footsteps, reached out and took it. Her voice was quiet. Not for the microphone, not for the crowd, just for him. I've waited 40 years to hear someone play that ballade the way I always heard it in my head. Where have you been? Preston's answer came without hesitation. Simple, unadorned. The truest sentence he'd spoken all night. Right here, cleaning floors. The gala didn't end that night. It transformed. The program was forgotten. The schedule, the speeches, the auction, the networking hour, all of it dissolved like sugar in water. What replaced it was something unplanned and unrehearsable. People moved toward Preston the way water moves downhill, naturally, inevitably, without anyone directing the flow. They didn't come with pity. That was the thing. No one tilted their head and said, "You poor man." No one squeezed his hand with that particular softness people reserve for those they consider broken. They came with something rarer. They came with respect. A retired federal judge introduced himself and couldn't finish his sentence. A woman who ran one of the largest arts nonprofits in the country handed Preston her card, then realized, with a flush of embarrassment, that a business card was useless to a blind man. She laughed. He laughed. She read her number aloud, and Darnell typed it into his own phone. Darnell. He'd finally stepped out of the service doorway and into the ballroom, still in his uniform, still with the damp streak on his sleeve where he'd wiped his face. He walked up to Preston the way he always did, steady, unhurried, no performance. Preston heard his footsteps and smiled. Not the polite smile he gave to strangers, the real one. "Took you long enough, Darnell?" "Man, I was trying not to ugly cry in front of rich people." The room laughed. Warm, human. The kind of laugh that loosens something in the chest and lets the tension drain out. For a moment, nobody in that ballroom was a senator or a CEO or a janitor. They were just people, standing in the afterglow of something they hadn't expected and couldn't explain. The young black cellist found Preston at the edge of the stage. She was still trembling. She took his hand, gently as if his fingers were made of something sacred, and said, "I almost quit music last month. I'm not quitting anymore." Preston squeezed her hand. "Don't you dare." 2 words, but the way he said them, quiet, certain, without a single note of performance, made the cellist press her free hand to her mouth and nod in a way that meant more than any standing ovation. Gerald and Audrey Whitmore left at 9:14. No announcement, no farewell. They slipped out through a side exit while the crowd's attention was elsewhere. Gerald's driver was waiting. Audrey walked 3 steps ahead of him now, not 2 steps behind, 3 steps ahead. Gerald said nothing during the drive home. Neither did she. But the silence between them was a new kind of silence, the kind that has teeth. In the days that followed, the world caught up. A guest's phone video hit the internet on Sunday morning. By Sunday night, it had 4 million views. By Wednesday, 12 million. The headline was everywhere. Every outlet, every platform, every language. The blind janitor and the billionaire's piano. The clip people shared most wasn't the climax. It wasn't the loudest part or the most technically brilliant passage. It was the 8 seconds of silence before the second movement. The moment Preston stopped, hands hovering, the room holding its breath, followed by the first note of Eleanor's melody. 8 seconds of nothing, then everything. That clip alone had 3 million shares. Constance Bellamy made a public statement the following Monday. She announced that she would personally sponsor Preston Hayes' return to the concert stage. She would fund the recording. She would make the calls. "I have heard every great pianist of the last 50 years, she said. Preston Hayes belongs among them. The fact that he's been cleaning floors instead of filling concert halls is not his failure. It's ours." Senator Crawford connected Preston with the National Arts Council. Within 2 weeks, he was offered a residency at the Kennedy Center. Preston accepted. But he made one condition. He wanted to establish a scholarship fund. Not a general fund, a specific one. For young musicians who'd been told their dreams were too complicated. Kids who didn't fit the mold. Kids who'd been looked at the way Gerald Whitmore looked at the cellist, as if their ambition was an inconvenience. The fund would be called the Eleanor Hayes Music Fellowship. She always said my hands were made for more, Preston told the reporter who asked about the name. She was right, but so are a lot of other hands that nobody's paying attention to. Gerald Whitmore's foundation lost 3 major corporate sponsors within a week. His PR team issued a formal apology, carefully worded, lawyer-approved, designed to minimize damage. The internet wasn't interested. Apologies built by committee don't stop bleeding, they just slow it down. Audrey Whitmore was photographed at the Kennedy Center announcement. Front row, alone. She didn't speak to reporters. She didn't need to. Her presence said everything her silence held back. The brass plate on the Steinway, the one engraved with Gerald Whitmore's name, was quietly removed by hotel staff the following Thursday. No one asked them to. They just did it. The morning after the Kennedy Center announcement, Preston Hayes woke up at 5:15. Same as always. The radiator clicked and hissed. 2 clicks. A long hiss. Pause. Repeat. 14 steps from bed to kitchen, left hand trailing the wall, fingertips reading the texture. The instant coffee was on the second shelf, right side, behind the salt. Nothing had changed. Everything had changed. He stood in the kitchen for a long time, holding his coffee, listening to the building breathe, the pipes, the neighbor's footsteps above, a dog barking somewhere on the first floor. The sounds of a life that was small and ordinary and entirely his. Then he did something he hadn't done in years. He knelt beside his bed, pulled out the wooden case, ran his fingers across the latches, cold metal, slightly rusted. He opened it. Inside, 3 pieces of sheet music, each signed by a different president of the United States. The paper was old. It smelled like dust and time, and a version of himself he'd almost forgotten existed. He touched the signatures, one by one, slowly, the way he touched Eleanor's photograph every morning. Not to read them, just to remember that they were real. He sat at his kitchen table. The coffee was getting cold. The radiator was still clicking. The final notice from his landlord was still on the counter. But for the first time since Eleanor died, Preston Hayes smiled. Not for an audience, not for a camera, not to prove anything to anyone. Just smiled. He whispered into the empty apartment. Quiet, almost inaudible. I kept my hands clean, baby. Just like you said. The world didn't hear that sentence, but it didn't need to. Some words aren't meant for the world. They're meant for one person. And sometimes that person isn't even in the room anymore. But you say them anyway, because love doesn't need a listener. It just needs a voice. If this story hit you somewhere real, share it. Not for the algorithm, for the person in your life who needs to hear it today. Subscribe if you want more stories like this. Every week we find the people the world overlooked, and we give them the spotlight they earned. Next week's story, a homeless man walks into a Michelin star restaurant. What happens next made the head chef resign and come back as a different person. You don't want to miss it. One last thing before you go. Have you ever watched someone get dismissed because of how they looked, what they wore, or where they worked? Did you speak up? Did someone speak up for you? Tell me in the comments, because every story we tell here started with someone just like you deciding that silence wasn't an option anymore. Preston Hayes couldn't see the standing ovation, but he felt every single pair of hands. And that was enough.